So excited to have you here tonight.
We have such an opportunity now to change people's lives for the better.
This was just part of an experiment. Put some pictures up online, got some good feedback.
We're going to get started in a few moments. We're just going to wait for a couple more people to come in. Hi, welcome. Thank you so much for coming to our second Mutual Aid Speaker Series event. I'm Annabelle. I'm a rising senior at Brookline High School, and I'm one of the organizers of the event. We are so excited to have this panel of women here to speak with us about their experience being disabled, especially during the coronavirus pandemic. This event is being broadcast on Big, so we ask that you keep yourself muted with video off at all times. However, you are more than welcome to use the reaction features. Also, it would be helpful if you went on to speaker view in Zoom. Before we get started with the program, I'm going to tell you a bit about what Mutual Aid has been doing over the past few months. Since the very beginning of the pandemic, Mutual Aid Brookline has created a network of people eager to find immediate solutions to the widespread needs of people affected by COVID-19. MAB recognizes that though Brookline is commonly thought of as a very well-off town, this is not the reality for many who live here. Through our initiatives, we have provided childcare, food deliveries, an emergency hotline, and more to Brookline community members who need our help. If you're interested in getting involved or have questions about who we are, you can email mutualaidbrookline@gmail.com. Right now, we will post a link to our GoFundMe as well as our Venmo and Cash App in the description box, in the chat box. When you have a moment during the program, please feel free to make a small donation to support all of the initiatives that I have just described. If everyone here donated just $10, that would go a long way towards buying food for a family that really needs it. I know that personally I donated to Mutual Aid because I feel so lucky for all of the privileges I had, and donating to Mutual Aid helps me share those with my community. Right now, I'm going to pass it off to one of our panelists, Jess, who will be leading a discussion that will last for about a half hour with the panelists, and then she'll be opening it up for questions, which we encourage you to type in the chat box at any time. Jess, take it away.
Hello, I'm Jess. I am a disabled, queer, Jewish art activist, and I'm excited to be with you all here tonight. I have been doing disability activism for about 8 years now, since I was diagnosed with narcolepsy, which I call one of my biggest disabilities. And I also have my master's in mental health counseling. And so I've gone through a bit of schooling and have seen firsthand a lot of the difficulties we meet as students. So I'm excited to be here today. And I'm excited to say hello to my two co-panelists, Eliana and Kat Terry. Eliana, could you introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, hi. I'm Eliana von Krusenstern. I am actually also one of the general organizers for Mutual Aid Brookline. So I've been working on organizing MAB since March. I grew up in Brookline, and so something that I'm going to talk about here is being disabled in the Brookline public school systems. I went to Lincoln School for the Brookline folks here from pre-K through 8th grade, and then I went to Brookline High School and I did 5 years there. And I have a background in chemistry and public health, and I actually just started my PhD at University of Pennsylvania in pharmacology with a focus in public health. So I have exclusively invisible disabilities. I have anxiety and depression, which I would say are like the biggest disabilities that affect me in day-to-day life, but I also have ADHD, which has had a really big impact on how I navigate educational spaces in academia. And yeah, I think that's about what there is to say about me for now. But yeah, thanks, Jess.
Thank you so much. Katieri, could you do a little intro for yourself as well?
Hello, my name is Katieri Collins, and I identify as a Black African-American woman who is disabled. Some of my disabilities include both visible and invisible. So I both struggle with a physical disability where I've had extensive 5 surgeries on my leg, and which has been a huge struggle and has limited my walking, as long with arthritis in my back and my knees and my ankle and foot. And so that is kind of an obvious disability. Like if I'm out in a cane or crutches or my wheelchair or with a boot on, because I'm often walking around with a boot. But invisible, dealing with like depression and complex PTSD is something that I internally and hide that I struggle with, but it's also a big part of a struggle. But I'm also here because as a Black woman, definitely with Black Lives Matter, that a lot of people, like it's a huge movement that we're so proud that's going on, but also like the disability community, like those who are Black and disabled aren't really, they're kind of more invisible. Like you don't really see them, you don't really hear talked about them. And those are individuals who need just as much help and who are so vulnerable. Not that no one else isn't invulnerable, but like they're especially a vulnerable population that also needs to be recognized and to be cared for. So I'm here to like talk about, like, even in education, my struggles of getting accessibility within the education system. I'm currently getting my master's in expressive art therapy and mental health counseling. So even those struggles of being disabled and being as a Black individual within the higher education system has also been a huge struggle in trying to really fight for myself, but also students for the future, and that can have a chance as well.
Thank you so much, Katieri. I'm so excited to continue to talk about all those things that we touched on a bit in the intro. And I feel like it naturally leads us into the first question, which is how did you start to identify as disabled, and what does that identity mean to you?
I mean, especially for me, like how I think a lot of people, it's like, oh, well, if it's visible, then it's more easier to identify. And so especially as I got older, when I first injured myself, I was like, oh, it's just an injury. But then as mental health became a huge struggle, and then on with the physical, I really came to identify that yes, these are struggles and that they are really pertinent in my life, and that, but it doesn't stop me from being who I am. And so it's like, I will say I am disabled and I've come to truth to that, and I'm okay with that. But there's also some things that I don't personally share. Like it's easier for people to see that, like if I'm in a boot or my, but I really see it's like, especially in this day and age, that like being visible of saying like, yeah, I'm disabled and that's okay. Like it shouldn't hinder me, which it hasn't sometimes, but it's like, it's okay to be disabled, and that doesn't mean that your life isn't going to prosper, which a lot of people assume that just because you're disabled that you're not smart, that you're low capacity, that you're lazy, you don't do anything, you're incapable of doing anything. And those are past the truth. As you can see, all our panelists, myself getting a master's, Jessica has gotten a master's, and now Eliana is getting a PhD. Like, so beyond what people like assume that people are disabled. And it just blows my mind that just because you're disabled doesn't mean that you can't, go through the world and do what you want.
Yeah, that like that idea of how people who are disabled kind of are pigeonholed, I think that kind of had a big impact on me in coming to terms with the fact that I do have disabilities. So, I mean, looking back, I think I have had disabilities since I was a kid, but I haven't identified as disabled until it was probably in college, I think. And so my anxiety and depression go way back to when I was like 9 years old and younger. And it was in high school that they got really bad. I was hospitalized a number of times. And it got bad enough that I just was not going to class. I was not doing any of my schoolwork. And I am lucky enough that I have parents who have the understanding, they have the education, and they have the knowledge of systems, that they were able to go to the school and say, hey, something's going on. Her grades are slipping. I was a straight A student and I was getting C's. And so they got me tested for an IEP, an individualized education plan, and they did all the testing. And at the end of it, they said, well, she's not failing, so we can't give her accommodations for her anxiety and depression. But by the way, you're off the charts for ADHD. And I was like 16 or 17, and I'd always been, you know, like one of the smart kids. So I was like, there's no way I have ADHD. I do well in school. I like school. I'm not one of like the troublemakers in class. And actually I remember talking to my mom and I was like, this can't be right. And my mom was like, well, actually this makes perfect sense to me. Like this explains so much. And my mom's watching, she's probably laughing right now. And so that even ADHD in itself, and this is something that the three of us, when we were talking previously, is it's a disability that is not fully described to people. But, and I think we can get into that later in terms of like the identity and diagnosis. But for me, then it took repeating a year of high school to then realize, okay, this is all a disability because I was not able to do school for a year. And if that's not a disability, like what is? If it's keeping me from doing academics, which I love school, I mean, I'm getting a PhD, then what is a disability if that isn't? And so that was kind of a revelation for me.
I feel bad, I'm sitting over here laughing, but I laugh because it just sounds so familiar to me.
Mm-hmm.
It's so, my first freshman year of college, I ended up redoing due to taking a medical leave. But my first freshman year of college was when I really developed the more difficult symptoms of my narcolepsy. And I couldn't go to class and I was failing out of classes. And I really just, I wasn't awake at the right times. I was only awake at night. There was no way for me I couldn't physically be awake during the day. And I took a medical leave and, I went through all of that. My narcolepsy diagnosis, which was my first big disability. Even though I already had an ADHD diagnosis at that time, I had not really accepted that one yet as part of my differences. And after that, I still hadn't thought about myself as really being disabled. And for me, it took until after I had gone through school, worked a little bit, I had more flare-ups and I got more sick and I wasn't able to work full time anymore. And even though I had worked in the disability community and I felt like I know I have disabilities, but that doesn't mean I'm disabled, which can be the case for some people. It's really important that we do not put the label of disabled on anyone. Disabled is a very, very personal label that can be extremely empowering. Yeah. But it's all about how, if you feel that your disability really significantly affects your day-to-day life. Does it affect your functionality? Does it cause you to have things that you need to really advocate for to get really an even playing field to everyone else? And when I looked at those basic points that I would give the advice to anyone else who's trying to figure out within themselves, I was like, well, really, I've been disabled this whole time. But for me, it took until it was physical, until people could see me with a cane, until I was occasionally needing my wheelchair, to really fully call myself disabled, loud, proud, and not feel afraid that I was taking anything away from anybody. There's always that imposter syndrome. But now it's a very important part of my identity. Especially as a disability advocate. But that's an important thing. It influences all the work I currently do. And I think that's something that we often forget of. Not just can disabled folks do many things, and there are some things different people can't do, and we have to listen to people about what their own individual limitations are, and that's okay. But disabled people can do so many things. And not only that, sometimes we have a unique perspective that is needed. And that's something we're also hoping to touch on tonight, especially with regard to the pandemic and living in a chronically ill world and possibly living in a remote world. But I think, keeping an eye on the clock, it might be time to move on a little bit to our next question, which is the importance of intersectionality in disability justice world. I know for myself, as someone who is queer, I don't have, there's are some issues that I additionally run into, but not nearly as much as there is in additional issues for those who face racial injustice in the disability community. And that's something we really want to talk about. So the fact that, as a part of fighting police violence and these disgusting atrocities we're seeing, noting that disabled people, most being Black disabled people, are facing these assaults at a higher rate. So I'll pass it off to you, Katieri.
Yeah, one thing that I do want to point out, especially in higher education, is that I can say, even as a Black individual, I do have privilege that I'm even in a graduate program. But even within that, it's like being a Black female disabled individual puts me at so many more disadvantages. And I've had to fight like twice as hard just to be able to get the accommodations that I need. I've had to prove myself that even though I at times had a 4.0 GPA, that was never good enough, that I was asking for too many accommodations. And when it got to the point where I was like, but by law, like disability law, I'm allowed to ask for accommodations. And then suddenly I was like, I've had enough. I'm going to call out your racism. I'm going to call out your ableism. I'm going to call out your discrimination. And then I'm retaliated against. And it's like, I'm just doing the work that I need to do to try to graduate, but also advocating for myself. But I know if this was a white student, this would have never happened. And the fact that, like, I just also want to point out that some people don't know that they can get accommodations, and that universities do. Like, honestly, I can relate to Jess that I actually failed out of my first college because I had a disability, didn't really understand it. And then when I transferred to another college, I went to the disability office and it was like, whoa, you actually have accommodations. You can actually get accommodations. And it makes a huge difference. But even within that, like, some professors were just like, they're racist and like, yeah, you have A work, but I don't care. I'm going to fail you anyway. And it's like, then I have to prove that it's like, I am capable. And that within like that community, and like already Black individuals within graduate programs are already getting horrendous treatment, that we need to be able to support them in some sort of way. What if that, like, as we mentioned, if you could donate, helping them be able to get books, that a lot of when they go to grad school, we might not have the money to buy books. And some of the basic resources that we don't have access to, like our white counterparts have access to, can even put us at a lower disadvantage. And that being able to support people in different little ways can make a huge difference. And having that community of, like, having your white counterparts, like, confront the university because they didn't listen to ourselves. So it's like, you know, these are wrongs that are going on and they need to be taken care of. And that even through all of that, you can get accommodations, whether the professors, but still they have to abide by it at some level. And I want people to know, even like Ilana said, you can get it in high school, you can get in college. I didn't know this till I went to my second undergrad. You go to the accommodation, there's a special department, disability office within your university. You can make an appointment with them. And also your disability is not outed. Like, that is private. There, you don't have to tell your professors what your disability is. You just get a piece of paper and you say, hey, these are some of my accommodations. They sign it. It's you don't have to out yourself, which does make a huge difference because, as we said, you know, disability is such a term that people see, there's such stigma around that term that at least that some sort of privacy within the university does help a little bit when you're not outed within those accommodation letters.
Yeah, I mean, I think about what I had to go through originally to get my accommodations, and I look at it and I know the only reason I am where I am today is because I have two parents who both have graduate degrees, and who feel comfortable going into the school and demanding that I am given they demanded that I was given appropriate accommodations because the school wouldn't give them to me because they said I wasn't failing. And, you know, my mom and dad went in and they said, if you won't give her accommodations, and then they wanted to put me in Winthrop House, which for those who are not part of Brookline, that is a program at Brookline High School that it's kind of like a therapeutic school. But the problem with it is that they only offer standard level classes. They don't offer like honors or advanced level classes. And for me, that I wanted to be in honors level classes, and the school didn't really give me that option. And so it took my parents saying, if you can't provide her the accommodations for her to be in those classes, then we're going to have to put her in a therapeutic private school, and the town will have to pay for that because legally you have to provide her with an appropriate education. And I think you should not have to have parents who feel comfortable going in and confronting the school administration to get what you need. And I am so lucky that I had that because most people don't. And that is a huge privilege that I have. As you know, I have white parents, so that allows some, you know, people take them seriously because people, you know, are racist. People take them seriously and they have education. And also then by watching them advocate for me, I'm now able to, I learned how to advocate for myself. And it is kind of insane that there are, you know, there are disability offices at every institution, but also at every institution, I have had to fight tooth and nail to get my disabilities, my accommodations respected. I had at Brookline High School, I had a math teacher who part of my accommodations were that if I was like really anxious, I could leave class because otherwise I'd have an anxiety attack. And so I would just say to the teacher, I'd say, I have to step out, and I would leave. And I said that to the teacher, and he took me out in the hall and said, well, I studied psychology for my bachelor's. And, you know, oftentimes it's better to actually try to work through it. So I really don't think you should leave class. I don't want you to leave class. And I just said, legally, you have to let me leave. And I left. But to be 17, 18, and have to confront your teacher like that, that is not acceptable. And again, I'm somebody like, again, from my position, I was in the position where I felt comfortable still saying to him, no. And so I feel like I have such privilege still in this marginalized identity that so many people don't have, and you should not have to have all of these things in order to get the basic accommodations for you to just get an education. There's too many hoops to jump through, and you need there's too many hoops, and you should not have to have so many extra boosters along the way to get you through them.
Absolutely. I love how we like naturally flew into the went over the next question too. But that's so important. It's also so important to acknowledge in a little of what you're talking about, of what you talked about already, of while a lot of places have accommodation programs, they're not always quite equipped to really handle the needs. You know, by the time you finally get to an accommodation office, getting an appointment is not always an easy thing. They require doctor documentation, which not everyone has. It is often a privilege to have access to a diagnosis. Healthcare is not available to absolutely everyone. The privilege, being able to get specialists, which is what you need to get an accurate diagnosis. I mean, I've had the privilege of being able to see so many specialists over the years, and half the time we still don't know if the diagnoses are accurate. And to require something to be so clear when that's just not how disability is, that's just not how chronic illness works, in order for someone to be able to get accommodations is a huge obstacle that, again, is faced even more by those who are also facing racial injustice and who are also facing being judged by many aspects of their identity. And so the other question that we had was, what lessons can we learn from these disability justice movements when we're talking about COVID and the pandemic and virtual learning versus in-school learning?
I mean, I can say for myself that going from in-person to remote was actually a huge benefit for me. And I also recognize that that is not necessarily the case with a lot of individuals, that there's certain individuals who need to have that in person to be able to learn at the level that they need to learn. And I can say for some people who have certain disabilities like myself, like going online was almost like, it was magical. Like, oh my gosh, this is awesome. Like, I could be in my own space and I could be in my comfortable computer chair. And if I needed to put up my legs, I could be in my recliner instead of having to walk a massive campus and even getting into a chair that possibly my legs could go numb because of the lack of support. And so suddenly I was in a space where I could attend to my needs as necessary, then that I could not have been able to do on campus, which has made a huge difference, and especially in terms of driving. I live far away from my university, so just a round trip was 3 hours. And so that also carried a lot of tiredness and money, gas money, in terms of having to drive 3 hours and then be in class for almost 3 hours. And it's exhausting. And then not even physically being able to attend to my physical needs either. So I personally have found online has been very helpful, but I recognize that that's not the case for everyone. And that especially kids who have autism or of older adults, or, you know, who are in school, and then also little kids, like you need that social interaction, and it works for some people and it doesn't work for other needs. And just personally for me, it has made a huge difference. And I think that schools and places need to recognize that sometimes in person is not always the solution, that maybe there's other programs that would fit better for other people's needs. regardless of like a disability or such.
Absolutely. There's so much we can learn from this point in time, both in school and overall through in the working world,
Yeah.
of how remote work can be done and can be beneficial for many.
Oh yeah.
There are, there are so many disability and body accommodations that we can have ready at home that it's just not feasible to have with us all the time when we're walking around from class to class. And things like that may seem small, but they aren't. They can take away so much pain. They can take away so much brain fog. They can take away so many other things that you have to deal with, that you can really focus on what's happening. I personally have done remote classes before because of my disability. And for me, I had issue because, well, it was much better for some of my physical disabilities. I could accommodate my fibromyalgia. I can accommodate my being in a comfortable spot. It was quite difficult for my ADHD brain.
Yeah.
I created certain things for myself that helped me through it, but I could not have gone through full school that way. I know I have family who I don't think will be able to learn that way because they think in a similar way than I do. And so it's also important when in this time that we have to be safe and we have to be careful about how many kids we're letting in a classroom. And it might have to be the case that only some kids are in the classroom, which is what's happening right now. How do we make sure we prioritize the needs, both of those who do better remote and those who need that additional attention?
Yeah.
Whether it's through disability or because they live in a home that doesn't have adults home during the day, they're out at work. And how do we really make sure that we're individualizing education to be most beneficial for all? We shouldn't have to choose doing well on tests or you get accommodations. I know I ran into a similar problem with Eliana. I was never able to get accommodations for my ADHD because frankly, a lot of females go undiagnosed, which is another thing, because it shows up differently. And we need to stop equating disability with completely not functioning. We need to figure out how to see that, first of all, anyone who's able-bodied is only temporarily able-bodied. Disability is the one intersectionality that's unique in that anyone could join it in any time, especially with a pandemic that has a virus that leads many people to have chronic illnesses afterwards. This is something we need to take with us and learn from as we're creating a partially remote world, and also making sure there is that attention for those who need that in-person focus.
Yeah.
Go here.
Well, I just think, yeah, like my experience with remote learning. So I'm doing remote learning for the first time right now. Starting school also for the first time. I'm in school for the first time in 2 years. That's also a whole other thing of like relearning how to study. And it's complicated for me because on one hand, when I'm having a depressive episode or acute anxiety, leaving the house is the hardest thing in the world. And so I either have to just like figure out how to get my ass out the door and get to class, or I miss class. And being able to do class from home eliminates that barrier. But my ADHD is really bad. And I'm lucky enough that I'm 25 now, and I've been diagnosed for almost 10 years. And so I've been able to work on tools to navigate my ADHD brain. And I have but I've had to work on this. And so I think back to when I was in high school, when I was in middle school, elementary school, doing remote learning, it would have been a nightmare for me. I would not have been able to do it. And I just think about, you know, what that's going to be like for kids. And that is really tough. And like right now, you can't see my desk, it's behind the computer, but I have, you know, a whiteboard with a to-do list, and I write up my schedule every day, and I have a planner where I have to put in all my assignments, and I have to keep so hyper organized. And it's just, that's what I would have to do anyway for class, but for remote learning, it is just completely, it is so, it's so much more. And I'm also now dealing with pre-recorded lectures where they're like, watch it whenever. Okay, well, for me, it's going to be really hard for me to sit down and watch a pre-recorded lecture. Having that live lecture forces me to sit down and watch it. If it's pre-recorded, I can put it off. And there's just all this stuff with ADHD brain. And something I want to touch on with that also is that I don't think that most people actually understand what it's like to have ADHD and what it actually means. I think a lot of people see it as, you know, you move around a lot, you're really hyper physically, and you talk a lot and you just don't pay attention. And that's not, there's so much more nuance to it that makes it, sometimes I feel like it's a superpower, and sometimes I feel like I just like am, you know, it's a nightmare. And so ADHD, there's like, I had to learn all of this on my own. And I really wish, you know, I'm always just saying, like, I wish somebody had told me all of these nuances. So with ADHD, you can get just completely distracted and not pay attention to some things, but you can also get hyper focused. And so, if you're really interested in something, you just kind of zoom in on what this is, and you can work on it for hours and not even realize and not stop to eat or drink any water. But you also, you know, like for me, I talk a lot and I am constantly just saying new things. And it's because I have so many thoughts just going through my brain. I describe it as there's like infinite conveyor belts going through my brain in all directions with just infinite ideas on each conveyor belt, and they're flying through my brain, and I'm just trying to grab at things before they go past, before I lose it, because I don't want to forget it. And so I do take medication for it. And for me, the medication kind of just slows down those conveyor belts and allows me to kind of just plug away at things. But then the medication, of course, then also makes me more anxious because they're stimulants. And so it's not really navigating these things. It's not just about being like, I'm bad at paying attention. It's just, my brain just works differently. It's not necessarily about attention. And so then that's one more thing I want to bring up, which is I realized just how much of a superpower my ADHD can be when I was organizing for Mutual Aid Brookline. So when we started Mutual Aid Brookline, it was me and Bonnie Bastian. And we were working 14-hour days to get this off the ground. And I was really dedicated to it. So I would get hyper focused and I would forget to eat all day, and I would work for 14 hours straight pretty much. And I would get a shitload of stuff done. And I also was really good at anticipating things. And Bonnie would be like, okay, maybe we should think about this. And I'd be like, I already wrote a protocol for this. Like, I already have this done. And I realized that the reason I could anticipate those things is because my brain is working at such a fast rate. And there's so much stuff just flying through it. And that's a superpower. That means that I can, you know, I anticipate things very differently. And so it is a disability because it prevents me from, it can be a hindrance in a classical learning environment and a classical work environment, but it's not all bad. And these are just not things that are talked about. And I think that's something I wanted to touch on because it's such a common disability and it is so highly diagnosed in little kids. And I don't think there's enough information out there about what it really is like to live with ADHD.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for mentioning all of that. You're absolutely right. And, you know, there's a lot of people who see disabilities that are neurodivergencies. So that's ADHD and autism. not as much as disabilities as much as they really are a neurological a different way of thinking. And is it really that they're, you know, that it might just be that the system's not set up for this type of thinking. Not that this type of thinking is any less beneficial. It's a different type of thinking that also has different benefits. And so that's so important. But we can't go too much into that. We're officially in our question and answer section. So I've gotten our first question from the chat. It is, who are some of your allies or people in positions of power that have been advocates for disability justice in your life? What did they do that you really appreciated, and what do you wish they did more of?
I mean, I can say for myself, as specifically as a person of color, is having conversations with other people of color who have gotten advanced degrees, and oftentimes because of racism, we have to frame how we talk to people within the educational system a very certain way. And so having that mentorship and saying, okay, this is how we're going to deal with this situation, but we have to be strategic about how the words that I actually use and the steps that go about that, and having people within who have had graduate degrees and who are Black folks have showed me how to do that. And that has been very helpful. And it's unfortunate that I have to be so strategic about what I say, the steps that I do, because it's like I have to be kind of politically in a political way to get what I need when I shouldn't have to do that. But I'm grateful for the community that I am who have gone to graduate school, including family, to show me like how to be able to navigate that world, that basically navigate within a racial institution.
Thank you. I think for me, a lot of what I touch with that is within the own community. I know I have a disabled supervisor who has been such an influence on me and my work and my confidence as a disabled person and what I'm able to do. And, you know, part of the question was allies or people in positions of power. And while I have lovely supportive family who've helped me as much as they can, there isn't something that they can do aside from really pushing those disabled voices and listening to those disabled voices that are really being good advocates for disability justice. And that's not something I've seen at all yet, really. There's not someone I think of I can point to that this is an ally or someone who, there are people I've seen run that finally address disability. I know we're joined by a recent candidate for the 4th Congressional District of Sound Lucky, who I was so happy to see run because I finally saw myself represented as a disabled person in her issues on her website, and it wasn't something that I'm used to seeing. But that's an area we're really still lacking. I really appreciate someone standing up for me, but you know, I'd rather they give me the place to voice my own experience, or give someone else who's disabled a voice that I can identify with. So that's how that question hits me a little bit. Anything?
Yeah, I mean, I think in academia, disability is not, you know, like there's affinity groups for so many different identities. And again, like I'm just starting grad school and I'm in the queer affinity group. There's one for women in STEM. There's groups for students of color. I've never seen an affinity group for disabled students. And I think that could be such a great resource, but part of the problem is disclosing that you have a disability can feel really dangerous. Like for me as a queer person, I am more worried about disclosing that I have disabilities than I am about disclosing that I'm queer. And part of that is also like, I live in Philadelphia, and generally it's a very liberal area. So of course I'm more comfortable disclosing my sexuality here than elsewhere. But, you know, academia has this, it's very problematic in like, the higher you get also, once you're in the graduate level and you're doing research, there's this idea of, you know, you have to dedicate your blood, sweat, tears, life, and soul to this pursuit of higher knowledge. And if you cannot completely throw yourself in and dedicate everything of your being, then you're not doing enough, which is such an, I mean, it's unhealthy, I think, for everybody, but it's also ableist. And that, you know, is a really big problem. And it's, I think, you know, like, I also, in the sciences particularly, it's like emotions and talking about your personal issues, that doesn't happen very much in the hard sciences. And I have disclosed to one research advisor in college, my thesis advisor, I did have to tell him because it was impacting me. And it was so scary. And I was so lucky. He was incredibly supportive. And, you know, he said the right things always when I said, I feel like I'm not getting enough done. He said, you are doing what you can, and you can't compare yourself to other people. And you can't compare yourself to what you might be if you're not dealing with this, because you are dealing with this. And that was what I needed to hear. I needed to hear that, you know, I'm good enough and I deserve to be there, and that he didn't see me as lazy, because that is such a fear that I think we all have. And yeah, I think academia really, that is one blind spot that, while I love learning and I am so excited to be getting my PhD and I want to be a professor, but there needs to be space to talk about that.
I also think, like, even in terms of all of this, it's like, in terms of when we talk about like a high activist person who works for us, I think that's why individuals like ourselves are tired. Because I know for myself, I refuse to give up. I continue fighting despite the tears, the crying, the sadness. It's almost like if I don't do it, then the individual behind me is not going to get what they need. And so I felt myself like continuously being an activist, because it's like, if I don't continue doing it, who knows what might happen to the generation or the individuals behind me. They might not get that they could get, but if I don't continue fighting.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And we're forced to be we're forced into become a self-advocate and basically forced into activism, or don't get what you need.
Yeah.
So we have our last question, and then I'll throw it back to Annabelle. Is, what changes have you seen overall during the pandemic that you want to see maintained in an ongoing way to improve disability access? And what are some changes we haven't seen yet that we should be pushing for?
I saw that and I had to answer right away. Telehealth and teletherapy.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes.
Like, teletherapy has changed my life. Because sometimes, so my therapist, I love her, but she's out in the suburbs. And so it's like a 45-minute train ride for me. I don't want to switch therapists, but sometimes I'm too stressed and anxious and depressed to get to therapy, which is ridiculous. And previously she could do it on the phone, but I think this is also an ADHD thing. Talking on the phone, if you don't see a face, is really hard. And it's like, I can't talk. I hate talking on the phone if I don't see somebody's face, because I just can't do it. I can't concentrate. And so all of a sudden, insurance now is allowing you to do video chat therapy. And that is revolutionary in a way where, like, it's just kind of crazy. And it allows me to do therapy from home when I, even moving forward, if I'm too anxious to get out of bed. But it also makes therapy so much more accessible for people who live in rural areas and people who don't live in places that have, I live in a city. There's so many places to go to therapy, but somebody who lives in a rural place doesn't have that. And that is incredible. Getting to talk to a doctor or a clinician or a therapist without leaving your home is, to me, has been revolutionary.
No, I agree. I mean, I can say for myself that doctor's appointments that would have taken months in the past, now because of telehealth therapy, instead of months, the wait's like a couple weeks now.
Yeah.
It's like, and I understand that there are some things that you have to do in person, but even just to be able to get into like a specialist, instead of having to wait for 6 months, and suddenly can get it 2 to 3 weeks, and then if you need to go in person, the process has started much faster, and your issues can be helped for much sooner instead of them getting worse. And so having that access of like you said, instead of driving in an hour and a half, suddenly I can talk to someone, a doctor on the computer, and be able to still have that specialist and speak to that specialist instead of having to shrug myself and drive an hour and a half, which is already exhausting when you're not feeling the best. And yes, teletherapy has been revolutionized, and I don't think that's going to go away. And I even think, I don't know if Jessica, in your Jewish community, if they've been televising at Temple. And I know within my church community, they've said they're not stopping it, because it's been such a way that like people who have chronic illnesses that can't go outside or want to be part of the community can't go, but suddenly now they can still, view the service, and still be able to be part of the community, even if they're out of state or, if they're confined to their homes. And I think that's another thing, is like very community-based things have also that's been revolutionized and should also stay as well.
Absolutely. Having that access to that spiritual healing, to that community is invaluable. And there's no reason that needs to be cut off and not being able to physically get there.
Yeah.
And telehealth and telemedicine, oh my goodness. I mean, I was homebound. I've been homebound for about a year and a half now. So I'm stuck in my home most of the time. Pretty similarly to COVID, I can, go to the store like maybe once every other week, not anymore. Now I stay put. But so my therapy, my options were paying out of pocket for texting, which can be very beneficial for many. And I will say I had more success with the texting therapy than I did with over the phone. But over video makes so much of a difference. And not to mention how much of a break is that for doctors with chronic illness. I mean, a large part of the community has disabilities. It's going to affect every single career. And we have learned just how many careers are able to go remote if needed. And so, that could never be a possibility when needed by a disabled person before. But jobs being even partially remote can make such a huge difference. I can't count how often when I'm doing work in the disability justice community that I'm asked for if I'm currently in a practice that people can get to as a therapist, or if I know any disabled therapists that I can recommend. And as a disabled therapist, I know that remote therapy is something I can provide, and something that could allow so many more disabled therapists to be able to get more hours and more access to those disabled clients that really need that understanding, that need to know that need their therapist to understand what life with a chronic illness is really like. I can't count how many therapists I've had to go into. Everyone who goes to therapy regularly has their little script down for a new therapist.
Yeah.
It's exhausting to have to go through all your medical issues, and then things you don't even realize. There's so many things that we have to deal with that other people don't. And because we have to deal with them daily, we don't necessarily realize other people don't have to deal with that. And so then you can get caught off track while you're having good work done by just having to explain your existence. And so having that access to more disabled, not just therapists, but all disabled providers, medical providers, having more careers that really have disability representation by having those remote accommodations so that we get those important different minds into that, you know, into the room, into the conversation. And so with that, it looks like our time is up. So I've got to give it back to Annabelle.
I would like to thank Eliana, Jess, and Katieri so much for being such wonderful panelists, and thank all of you for coming to this event tonight. I hope you have a chance to donate before you leave, but otherwise, have a great night.